The world had dissolved into a blinding maelstrom of ochre dust and screaming wind. In the unforgiving heart of the Arizona Territory, a lone woman fought her way back to a homestead that was little more than a memory in the storm. But then she heard it a sound that did not belong to the tempest. It was a faint human cry, nearly swallowed by the gale. Answering that sound would set in motion a chain of events spanning 2 decades, an act of compassion that would be repaid in a way no one could have ever predicted, proving that even in the harshest landscapes, the deepest debts are never truly forgotten. The year was 1873. The Arizona sun, a merciless tyrant in the sky, had been blotted out. In its place, a churning wall of sand and grit descended upon the parched earth. Abigail Finch leaned into the gale, a coarse woolen shawl wrapped tight around her head, tasting the dust that coated her teeth and stung her eyes. Every gust threatened to tear her from the reins of her stubborn mule patience, who stood with her head bowed, a statue of dusty resignation. Abigail's ranch, a modest patch of hope carved out of the unforgiving landscape by her late husband, Thomas, was only a mile away, but it might as well have been on the other side of the continent. Thomas had been gone 2 years, taken by a fever that swept through the territory like a phantom thief. He had left her with the ranch, a well that never ran dry, and a legacy of quiet determination that now felt like a laid weight in her soul. She was a botanist by passion, a rancher by necessity. Her hands, though calloused from mending fences and tilling soil, knew the delicate language of plants which ones could heal, which could nourish, and which could kill. It was this knowledge that had taken her out into the scrubland today, searching for the elusive desert marigold and creosote bush staples for her salves and tinctures. But the sky had turned on her with shocking speed, the gentle breeze twisting into a howling banshee. That's when she heard it. It wasn't the shriek of the wind or the groan of a struggling mesquite tree. It was a whimper, thin and desperate, almost lost in the chaos. Abigail froze, pulling back hard on Patience's reins. She strained her ears, convincing herself it was a trick of the wind, perhaps a coyote pup separated from its mother. She had her own survival to think of. To stop now, to wander from the faint trail back to her cabin, was to court death. But the cry came again, sharper this time, laced with an undeniable thread of human suffering. Duty, or perhaps a profound loneliness that yearned for any connection won out over fear. Tying a rope from her belt to the mule's saddle horn so they wouldn't be separated, Abigail dismounted and began to move toward the sound. One hand held up to shield her face. She stumbled through the blinding dust, her boots sinking into the shifting ground. The world was a formless, suffocating cloud. She found him curled at the base of a cluster of sandstone rocks that offered pathetic shelter. He was a small boy, no older than 5 or 6, his Apache heritage clear in his straight black hair, now matted with sand, and the simple leather tunic he wore. He was alone, unconscious, his small body trembling with violent shivers. His lips were blue and cracked. As she knelt, her botanist's eye caught the real source of his agony. His left calf was swollen to twice its normal size, the skin a terrifying patchwork of angry red and deep purple. 2 small puncture marks, the unmistakable signature of a rattlesnake, were at the center of the inflammation. The venom was already doing its work. He was dying. Panic flared in Abigail's chest, hot and sharp. The nearest doctor was in the town of Redemption, a full day's ride in good weather. In this storm, it was an impossible journey. The boy would be dead in hours. But she wasn't a doctor. She was something else. She was a woman who understood the secrets of the desert. "All right, child," she murmured, her voice rough against the wind. "All right. We're not giving up yet." Working with a frantic, desperate energy, she half-dragged, half-carried the boy's limp form back to her mule. Getting him onto Patience's back was a Herculean effort, his dead weight a terrible burden. She secured him with another length of rope, his head lolling against the mule's neck. Then, taking the reins, she began the agonizing trek back to her cabin, praying to a god she hadn't spoken to since Thomas died. The cabin was a sanctuary against the storm's fury. Once inside, with the door barred and the shutters latched, the world was reduced to the howl of the wind outside and the boy's shallow, ragged breaths within. She laid him gently on her own cot, his feverish skin burning to the touch. There was no time to waste. She didn't have the sophisticated antivenom a doctor might possess, but she had the desert's own pharmacy. While a kettle of precious water heated on the wood stove, Abigail rushed to her drying racks. Her fingers, deft and sure, flew over the bundled herbs. She grabbed a fistful of dried creosote leaves, known to the local tribes as a powerful blood purifier. She added desert marigold, a natural anti-inflammatory. Finally, she took a prickly pear cactus pad she'd harvested last week, and with a sharp knife scraped out the thick, mucilaginous pulp. She crushed the dried herbs with a mortar and pestle, the frantic grinding a counterpoint to the storm. She mixed the powder into the cactus pulp, creating a thick, greenish poultice that smelled of rain and earth. While it steeped, she took her sharpest blade and, after sterilizing it in the stove's flames, took a deep breath. Leaning over the boy, she whispered, "This will hurt. Forgive me." She made 2 small, shallow incisions over the fang marks, reopening the wound. Dark, sluggish blood beaded on the surface. She squeezed gently, trying to draw out as much of the venom-tainted fluid as she could before it traveled further. The boy moaned, a heart-wrenching sound that sliced through Abigail. Finally, she applied the warm poultice, spreading the thick paste over the entire swollen area. She wrapped his leg tightly with strips of clean cotton, torn from one of her own petticoats. The final step was forcing him to drink. She brewed a weak, bitter tea from the remaining creosote, and lifting his head, managed to trickle a few sips past his cracked lips. For the rest of that day, and through the long, howling night, Abigail sat by his side. She changed the poultice every few hours, cooled his brow with damp rags, and forced more of the bitter tea into him. She watched his chest rise and fall, each breath a victory. She spoke to him in low, soothing tones, telling him about her husband, about the stars, about the flowers that would bloom after the storm passed. She didn't know if he could hear her, but the sound of a human voice she believed was a medicine in itself. Sometime before dawn, as the wind began to lose its rage, the boy's fever broke. The violent shivers subsided into a deep, more peaceful sleep. His breathing evened out. Abigail touched his forehead. It was still warm, but the terrifying, consuming heat was gone. She slumped back in her chair, exhaustion washing over her, in a wave so powerful it left her dizzy. Looking at the sleeping Apache child, a fragile life she had wrestled back from the brink, she felt the first flicker of something other than grief she had felt in 2 years. She had saved him. Now she had to figure out what to do with him. The storm broke as suddenly as it had arrived. Morning dawned clear and bright. The desert air washed clean, smelling of damp earth and creosote. The landscape once choked with dust was now stark and beautiful in the early light. The boy was still asleep, but his color had returned, and the swelling in his leg had noticeably receded. Abigail knew the danger had not passed entirely, but the worst was over. Her decision was already made. He belonged to his people. To keep him would be tantamount to kidnapping an act that would invite retribution she could not possibly withstand. The Chiricahua Apache territory began in the foothills of the Dragoon Mountains, less than a half-day's ride to the east. It was a dangerous journey for a lone white woman, but it was the only honorable choice. After forcing the boy, now awake but weak and disoriented, to drink some thin broth she prepared for the journey, he watched her with large dark eyes that held a mixture of fear and curiosity. He did not speak, and she did not press him. Words were unnecessary. She pointed to his leg, then to the mountains visible through the cabin window. He seemed to understand. The ride was tense. Abigail sat astride Patience, the boy seated in front of her, his small frame nestled against her for support. She held a rifle across her lap, more for appearance than any real expectation of using it. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every glint of sun on rock a potential observer. The stories settlers told about the Apache were terrifying tales of violence and merciless raids, yet the child in her arms was just that, a child. They found the encampment nestled in a hidden canyon, the smoke from its fires a thin gray smudge against the blue sky. As they approached, 2 riders broke away from the camp and galloped toward them, their figures shimmering in the heat. They were armed with rifles and wore grim expressions. They reined in their ponies a dozen yards away, cutting off Abigail's path. Abigail raised one hand, palm open, in a gesture of peace. Her heart hammered against her ribs. "I have come to return a child," she called out, her voice steadier than she felt. The warrior's eyes fell on the boy in her arms. A flicker of recognition, then astonishment crossed their faces. One of them let out a sharp cry in his own tongue and wheeled his horse around, racing back towards the camp. The other remained, his rifle held loosely, but his gaze fixed on her, sharp and appraising. Within minutes, the camp emptied. Men, women, and children poured out their expressions, a mixture of disbelief and apprehension. An older man, with a face like carved granite and eyes that held the weight of immense sorrow, pushed his way to the front. He wore the markings of a chief. This, Abigail surmised, must be the boy's father. She dismounted carefully, helping the boy down. He was still unsteady on his feet. As soon as his moccasins touched the ground, he stumbled toward the chief, crying out, "Father!" The chief swept his son into his arms, burying his face in the boy's hair. A collective sigh of relief and wonder rippled through the crowd. The chief, whose name was Nashit, held his son at arm's length, examining him, his hands tracing the boy's face as if to confirm he was real. His eyes then fell on the crude bandage around his son's leg. He unwrapped it carefully. The skin was still discolored and tender, but the wound was clean, the swelling dramatically reduced. An elderly woman with a wise, wrinkled face stepped forward and peered at the poultice Abigail had left on the wound. She sniffed it, then touched it with a wrinkled finger. She looked up at Abigail, then spoke to Nashit in a low, rapid torrent of Apache. Nashita's gaze lifted to meet Abigail's. The raw grief was still there, but it was now mingled with a reluctant gratitude. He spoke his English, heavily accented but clear. "My son's mother. The storm took her. She was trying to get him to the rocks. He said a woman found him, a woman with hair the color of the sun." Abigail simply nodded her throat, too tight to speak. "You used the old woman's breath," Nashit said, gesturing to the creosote. "And the sun spirit flower. Our ways." "How?" "I study the plants," Abigail replied softly. The desert provides its own cures, if you know where to look. A silence fell over the canyon, thick with unspoken thoughts. Abigail had crossed a cultural divide, not with force, but with knowledge, their knowledge. Nachit looked from his son Taza to Abigail, then back again. He gave a curt nod. "A debt has been made." He said the words formal and cold. "The Chiricahua do not forget debts, or trespassers. Your presence here is finished. Go." It was a dismissal, not an invitation. There would be no shared meal, no warm thanks. The debt was acknowledged, a spiritual ledger balanced, but the chasm between their worlds remained as wide as ever. One of the warriors silently escorted her to the edge of their territory. As she rode away, she glanced back once. Taza was watching her, a small, solitary figure standing beside his powerful father. He did not wave. Returning to her ranch felt like returning to a different world. The silence of her cabin was heavier than before. The encounter had left her unsettled, an outsider to two worlds no longer fully belonging to the settler community, with its fears and prejudices, and forever an alien to the Apache. A week later, a new kind of visitor arrived. A man on a fine black stallion, dressed in a tailored suit that looked ridiculously out of place against the dusty backdrop. He was handsome in a severe way, with cold blue eyes and a smile that never reached them. "Ma'am," he said, tipping his hat as he dismounted. "Silas Blackwood. I believe I own the neighboring spread to the east." Abigail knew of him. Blackwood was a name spoken with a mixture of awe and fear in redemption. He'd arrived a few years ago with a fortune of unknown origin and had been buying up land at an astonishing rate, often from ranchers who had suddenly fallen on hard times. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her tone neutral. "I won't beat around the bush, Mrs. Finch," he said, his gaze sweeping over her small but well-kept property. "I'm consolidating my holdings. Your ranch particularly, its access to that little creek is of interest to me. I'm prepared to make you a very generous offer, more than fair, enough to set you up comfortably back east away from all this harshness." Abigail's spine stiffened. This ranch was all she had left of Thomas. "The ranch is not for sale." Blackwood's smile tightened, almost imperceptibly. "Every man has a price, Mrs. Finch, and every woman a point where sentimentality becomes a liability. Think on it. The desert is a lonely place for a woman on her own. Things happen." The veiled threat hung in the air long after he had ridden away. Abigail stood on her porch, watching the dust settle, a new and more insidious storm gathering on the horizon. The debt the Apache chief had spoken of felt 1,000,000 miles away. Here in her world, survival was about to become a different kind of battle. Silas Blackwood was a patient predator. His initial assault was not with force, but with a slow, creeping strangulation. A month after his visit, Abigail woke one morning to a disturbing silence. The gentle gurgle of Whispering Creek, the lifeblood of her ranch that irrigated her small vegetable patch and watered her modest herd of cattle, was gone. She rushed to its banks. The creek bed was not dry, but the flow had been reduced to a pathetic trickle, not enough to sustain life for long. She followed it upstream for 2 miles, her heart sinking with every step until she found the cause. A crudely constructed dam of rock and timber had been erected just inside the border of Blackwood's property, diverting the majority of the water into a newly dug channel leading toward his vast rangeland. It was legal, just barely. As the upstream landowner, he had rights to the water. But it was a cruel and deliberate act designed to choke her out. She rode into Redemption to file a complaint with the sheriff. Sheriff Brody was a good man, but a weary one. He was a man whose authority was dwarfed by the sheer size of the territory he was meant to police and the power of men like Blackwood. "I hear you, Abigail," he said, polishing a pair of spectacles with a sigh. "But my hands are tied. He ain't broken the law, not technically. Water rights are a messy business. I can go and have a word with him, but—" The unspoken end of the sentence hung in the air. It won't do any good. His deputy, a surly man named Miller with shifty eyes and a perpetual sneer, made no effort to hide his disdain. "Maybe you should have taken Mr. Blackwood's offer," he drawled, leaning back in his chair. "This ain't no place for a woman alone." Abigail left the sheriff's office with a cold knot of dread in her stomach. The law was a distant concept here. Power was what mattered, and she had as none. The following weeks were a slow descent into despair. Her vegetable garden withered under the relentless sun. The leaves of her corn stalks turned brown and brittle. She spent her days hauling buckets of water from her well, a back-breaking task that yielded just enough to keep her and a few of the plants alive. Then the cattle started getting sick. It began with a prize heifer Thomas had been so proud of. She found it lying by the nearly dry creek, its breath coming in labored rasps, foam on its lips. Within a week, 3 more were dead. Abigail, with her knowledge of plants, recognized the signs of poison. Not snake venom, but something else. She found traces of what looked like oleander leaves, a plant not native to that immediate area scattered near the water source. Someone had deliberately poisoned her herd. Blackwood's men, a rough-looking crew, began riding the perimeter of her land, their presence a constant, silent intimidation. They never crossed the line, never spoke to her, but they were always there watching. One evening, Blackwood himself paid her another visit. He found her by the cattle graves. She'd been forced to dig, her face smudged with dirt, her spirit worn thin. "A string of bad luck, Mrs. Finch," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "It's a sign, perhaps. The land itself is telling you it's time to move on. My offer still stands. In fact, given your recent losses, it's more generous than ever." "You did this?" Abigail said, her voice trembling with a rage that was all she had left. "You diverted my water. You poisoned my cattle." Blackwood feigned a look of shock. "Such terrible accusations. You have no proof, of course. Just the wild imaginings of a grieving woman who is clearly in over her head. Accept the offer, Abigail," he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "Or the next bit of bad luck might befall the house itself. Fires are so common in the dry season." He rode off, leaving his threat to poison the air. Abigail felt a profound and terrifying isolation. She was a single woman standing against a wealthy, ruthless man who was systematically destroying her life piece by piece. The law wouldn't help her. Her neighbors were too scared of Blackwood to intervene. She was utterly alone. That night, unable to sleep, she sat on her porch, her late husband's shotgun across her lap. She looked east toward the dark, sleeping shapes of the Dragoon Mountains. She thought of the Apache boy Taza and the cold, formal debt his father had acknowledged. It felt like a lifetime ago, a strange dream that had no bearing on her current nightmare. The unspoken debt of the Chiricahua was a whisper in the wind, drowned out by the loud, brutal reality of Silas Blackwood's greed. Hope was a luxury she could no longer afford. The breaking point came a week later on a moonless, starless night. Abigail was jolted from a restless sleep, not by a sound, but by a smell, the acrid, unmistakable stench of smoke. Then came the hellish orange glow, flickering against her bedroom window. She threw on her boots and burst out of the cabin. The sight stole the air from her lungs. Her barn, the barn Thomas had built with his own 2 hands, the structure that held her meager stores of hay, her tools, her saddle was engulfed in flames. Fire roared toward the sky, a monstrous living thing, consuming years of hard work and memory in its hungry maw. She ran toward it, a bucket in hand, a futile gesture against the inferno. The heat was a physical blow driving her back. Sparks rained down, catching the dry grass around the barn, and she frantically beat them out with a wet sack, her actions driven by pure primal instinct. There was nothing she could do for the barn. It was already a skeleton of blazing timber. All she could do was stop the fire from reaching her cabin. For what felt like hours, she fought the spreading grass fires, her face blackened with soot, her lungs screaming for clean air. The roar of the blaze was a deafening testament to Silas Blackwood's final cruel message. He had warned her. By the time the sun began to rise, the barn was a smoking, smoldering ruin. The fire had been contained, but everything of value save the cabin itself was gone. Her livelihood, her connection to her past, all of it reduced to ash and charcoal. Abigail stood there, staring at the wreckage, and felt something inside her snap. It wasn't anger anymore. It was a vast, hollow emptiness. Blackwood had won. He had systematically dismantled her life, and now he had burned its heart. There was nothing left to fight for. She walked back to the cabin in a daze, past the graves of her cattle, past the withered garden. She packed nothing. Possessions no longer mattered. She simply saddled Patience, the last living creature on the ranch that mattered, filled a canteen from the well, and rode away from the smoking ruins without a backward glance. She didn't ride west toward redemption. There was nothing for her there but pity and fear. She didn't ride east toward the Apache. What could she do, beg for help based on a cold 20-year-old debt? It was absurd. She just rode. She rode south into the vast, empty expanse of the Chihuahuan Desert, with no destination in mind. She was a ghost on a ghost mule, fleeing the wreckage of her life. For 2 days, she moved in a stupor of grief and exhaustion. The sun beat down on her, and the canteen was soon empty. Patience, ever loyal, plodded onward, but her steps grew slower, more labored. On the 3rd day, Abigail's strength gave out. The world began to swim, the harsh landscape blurring at the edges. She slid from the saddle, her body too weak to hold on any longer, and collapsed onto the hot, unforgiving ground. Patience nudged her with her nose, but Abigail couldn't move. Her last conscious thought was of the irony, after surviving the sandstorm, the snakebite and the fire, she was going to die of thirst in a silent, empty wilderness. She awoke to a face hovering over her. It was not the face of an angel. It was the weathered, creased face of an Apache man, his hair streaked with gray, his dark eyes studying her with an unreadable expression. He held a water skin to her lips, and she drank greedily the cool liquid, a shock to her system. When she could finally speak, her voice was a dry rasp. "Who?" "You are on Chiricahua land," the man said. He was not one of the warriors she had seen before. He was older, a scout by the look of his gear. I was lost," she whispered. The scout's eyes traveled over her soot-stained clothes, her exhausted state. He then looked at her hair, still the color of pale corn silk, though now streaked with dust and gray. A flicker of something not quite recognition, but consideration passed through his eyes. "The spirits have led you to a strange place," he said cryptically. He helped her to her feet, his grip surprisingly gentle. "You cannot stay here. Come. Our chief will decide what is to be done with you." Leaning on the scout with Patience trailing behind Abigail, began a slow, stumbling journey. She had no idea where she was going or what awaited her. She had fled her own world, only to fall into the one she had been warned to avoid her entire life. As they crested a small rise, she saw an encampment below them, larger and more permanent than the one she had visited all those years ago. The scout led her into the heart of the camp. People stopped and stared, their faces a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. She was brought before a large central lodge. The scout entered, leaving her outside. A few moments later he emerged and gestured for her to enter. Taking a deep breath, Abigail stepped out of the blinding sun and into the cool dimness of the lodge. Her eyes took a moment to adjust. Several men sat in a circle, but her attention was immediately drawn to the man seated in the place of honor. He was not the aging Chief Nachite she had met before. This man was in his prime, perhaps in his late 20s, with broad shoulders and a commanding presence that filled the space. His face was stern, etched with the responsibilities of leadership, but his eyes were dark and piercingly intelligent, and on his left leg, visible just above the top of his moccasin, was a faint silvery network of scars, the ghost of a long-ago rattlesnake bite. The scout spoke in Apache, gesturing toward her. The chief listened intently, his gaze never leaving Abigail's face. When the scout finished, a heavy silence descended on the lodge. The chief rose to his feet. He was taller than she had imagined, a man radiating power and authority. He walked toward her, stopping just a few feet away. He looked at her for a long moment, a lifetime of unspoken history passing between them. Then he spoke, his voice a low, resonant baritone, his English perfect, learned from years of forced negotiations and observation. "I am told you are the woman with hair the color of the sun," he said. "The woman who understands the desert's secrets. I am Taza, and I believe a debt is owed." Abigail stared, speechless. The small, feverish boy she had pulled from the grip of a sandstorm was gone. In his place stood this man Taza, the chief of the Chiricahua Apache. The weight of 20 years of her entire struggle seemed to crash down on her at once. The world had tilted on its axis. Taza's face remained impassive, but his eyes held a depth of memory that belied his stern demeanor. He had not forgotten. He gestured for her to sit, and a space was made. Water was brought, and this time it was offered not as a necessity for a trespasser, but as a courtesy to a guest. "My father Nachite passed into the spirit world 3 winters ago." Taza explained, his voice resonating in the quiet lodge. "He spoke of you before he died. He said a debt remained unsettled, a debt of life." Abigail found her voice, though it was shaky. "I never expected repayment, Chief Taza. I did what anyone would have done." "No," Taza corrected her, his gaze unwavering. "Not anyone. In a land where my people are seen as ghosts or savages, you saw a child. You used our own medicine to save me. My father never forgot that. He taught me that a debt of honor is heavier than any stone. Tell me why you are here. Tell me why the ghost of a fire clings to you and why your spirit is broken." And so she told him. The words poured out of her, the story of Silas Blackwood, the diverted water, the poisoned cattle, the constant intimidation. She spoke of Sheriff Brody's helplessness and Deputy Miller's contempt. And finally she told him about the fire, about the smouldering ashes of her barn, and her husband's legacy. As she spoke, she did not weep. The emptiness inside her had burned past tears. She spoke with the flat, detached calm of someone who had already lost everything. The elders in the lodge listened, their faces grim. They understood the language of greed, the slow, relentless pressure the white settlers used to claim the land. When Abigail finished, a profound silence filled the lodge. It was Taza who broke it. "This man Blackwood," he said, the name sounding like a curse on his tongue. "He seeks to own the water, the Whispering Creek." "Yes," Abigail confirmed. "He wants the land for the water." Taza looked at one of the elders. "The creek flows from our mountains. It feeds the hunting grounds in the southern valley before it reaches the white man's ranches. If he poisons it for one, he poisons it for all." The implication was clear. Blackwood's war against Abigail was no longer a private matter. He had, in his ignorance and arrogance, trespassed upon the resources of the Chiricahua. Taza stood and walked to the entrance of the lodge, looking out at the sun-drenched landscape. "For 20 years I have carried the memory of a storm, of a woman's kindness in the face of that storm. I have led my people through war and through the bitter peace of the reservations. I have learned the ways of the white man, not to become him, but to understand him. Their power comes from paper laws and deeds, and from fear." He turned back to face her, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than stern authority showed in his eyes. It was a fierce, protective fire. "They will not have your land," he said, the statement a vow, "and they will not have your spirit. Rest. Heal. The debt will be paid, not with beads or horses. It will be paid with justice." Abigail stayed in the Apache camp for 2 days. She was given a small lodge of her own, and the same elderly woman who had first recognized her poultice, whose name was Isha, tended to her. Isha brought her food and herbal teas that soothed her ragged nerves and restored her strength. For the first time in years, Abigail slept without fear. She was surrounded not by enemies, but by a quiet, powerful sense of purpose. She watched Taza as he moved through the camp. He was a leader born of 2 worlds. He possessed the ancient wisdom and ferocity of his people, but he also had a keen strategic understanding of the society that was encroaching upon them. He was not a reckless warmonger. He was a chess player. On the morning of the 3rd day, Taza approached her. Behind him stood a dozen of his best warriors, mounted on strong ponies, their faces painted not for war, but for solemn purpose. They were silent, disciplined, and formidable. "It is time to return to redemption," Taza said. "But you will not go alone." Abigail looked at the imposing force behind him, her heart pounding. "What are you going to do?" "Blackwood understands the language of fear," Taza replied, his hand resting on the neck of his own powerful warhorse. "We will speak to him in a tongue he cannot ignore, and then we will speak to the law. But this time the law will listen." He mounted his horse, a chief in full command, the faint scars on his leg, a hidden reminder of the bond that tied his past to hers. As Abigail mounted Patience, surrounded by a guard of Apache warriors, she felt a surge of hope so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. She had ridden away from her home a broken victim. She was riding back as an instrument of a justice as old and unforgiving as the desert itself. The arrival of a dozen Chiricahua warriors on the outskirts of redemption sent a shockwave of panic through the small settlement. Doors were bolted, windows shuttered. Men grabbed their rifles and peered out, their faces pale. This was the nightmare they all feared, an Apache raid. But the warriors did not raid. They did not shout or charge. Led by Taza, they took up a silent, watchful position on the rise overlooking the town. Their presence was more unnerving than any attack. It was a quiet, suffocating display of power, a declaration that the town of redemption was now under observation. Taza Abigail and two of his most trusted warriors, however, did not remain on the hill. They rode calmly down the main street. People scattered before them. They stopped not at Blackwood's ranch, but directly in front of the sheriff's office. Sheriff Brody emerged, his hand hovering nervously near his pistol. His eyes were wide with disbelief, first at the sight of the warriors on the hill, then at the sight of Abigail Finch, alive and well, riding beside the Apache chief himself. Deputy Miller appeared behind him, his usual sneer replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated fear. "Chief Taza," Brody stammered, addressing the Apache leader with a respect born of terror. "What is the meaning of this? I am here on behalf of Mrs. Finch," Taza announced, his voice carrying in the tense silence. "And on behalf of my people. An injustice has been done." He dismounted and stood before the sheriff, his stature alone a form of intimidation. Abigail dismounted and stood beside him. "This man, Silas Blackwood, has committed crimes," Taza stated plainly. "He has stolen water, poisoned livestock, and burned this woman's property to force her from her land." "Those are serious claims," Brody said, sweating under the midday sun. "But I have no proof." "Then we will provide it," Taza said. He turned to one of his warriors, who reached into a leather pouch. The warrior produced a heavy, ornate silver spur, its rowel shaped like a star. He handed it to Taza. "My scout found Mrs. Finch near death in the desert," Taza explained, holding up the spur for the sheriff to see. He backtracked her trail to the ashes of her barn. This was found in the dirt near the point of origin of the fire, dropped by a man in a hurry. Deputy Miller's eyes widened. He visibly flinched. Abigail looked from the spur to the deputy, and a cold realization dawned on her. She had seen that spur before on the boot of one of Blackwood's foremen, a man named Hank, who often rode with Miller. "Furthermore," Taza continued, his voice like cold steel, "the creek Blackwood has dammed feeds our hunting ground. The poison he used on Mrs. Finch's cattle seeps into the water table. He threatens our resources. An act against her is now an act against the Chiricahua. This is no longer a dispute over a deed. It is a violation of the treaty." The mention of the treaty changed everything. That was a federal matter. Suddenly, this wasn't about a local land squabble. It was about a potential conflict that would bring the U.S. Army to their doorstep. Sheriff Brody's face went from pale to ashen. At that moment, Silas Blackwood himself came striding down the street, flanked by two of his hired guns. He had seen the warriors, and had come to confront what he assumed was a simple shakedown. "What in God's name is this, Brody?" Blackwood bellowed. "Get these savages out of my town!" His eyes fell on Abigail, and a look of venomous fury crossed his face. You should have died in the desert." "She didn't," Taza said, stepping forward. "And now you will answer for your crimes." He held up the spur. "I believe this belongs to one of your men, the one who likes to play with fire." Blackwood's arrogant demeanor faltered. He glanced at Deputy Miller, who refused to meet his gaze. In that moment, Blackwood saw his power structure crumbling. The law which he had so easily manipulated was now backed by a force it could not ignore. "This is nonsense," Blackwood blustered, but his voice lacked conviction. he made a fatal mistake. His hand twitched toward the pistol at his hip. He never cleared the leather. In a movement too fast to follow, Taza's hand shot out and gripped Blackwood's wrist, twisting it with bone-jarring force. Blackwood cried out in pain, his pistol clattering to the dust. The two warriors behind Taza had their own weapons drawn, aimed not at Blackwood, but at his two henchmen, who froze with their hands raised. "Deputy Miller," Sheriff Brody said, his voice finally regaining a measure of authority as he saw the balance of power shift. "You know something about this spur, don't you?" Miller, trapped between the icy stare of the Apache chief and the desperate glare of his former employer, crumbled. It was Hank," he stammered. "Blackwood's foreman. He told me, he said Blackwood ordered him to set the fire." It was over. The confession, coerced by the silent threat of a dozen Apache warriors and the presence of their unwavering chief, sealed Blackwood's fate. His power, built on fear and intimidation, evaporated in the harsh light of day. Blackwood and his men, including the now confessing Deputy Miller, were taken into custody. The dam on Whispering Creek was dismantled the next day. The federal marshals, alerted by Sheriff Brody about the treaty violation, arrived a week later to ensure Blackwood would face justice for his crimes. Abigail returned to her ranch. Taza sent a dozen of his own people to help her. In 2 weeks, a new barn stood where the old one had fallen built, with a combination of settler tools and Apache know-how. The two groups worked side by side, a quiet, respectful collaboration that would have been unthinkable just a month prior. Before he returned to the Dragoon Mountains, Taza came to see her one last time. They stood on her porch, looking out at the healing land. "The debt is paid," Taza said. "It is more than paid." Abigail replied, her voice thick with emotion. "You gave me back my life, Taza, just as I once did for you." He simply nodded the bond between them, needing no more words. He mounted his horse, and with a final searching look turned and rode east, a chief returning to his people. Abigail Finch stood and watched him go, no longer a victim, but a survivor. She was a woman who had saved a dying Apache child in a sandstorm, and 20 years later, in a storm of a different kind, he had returned as a chief to save her right back. The autumn that followed was one of quiet miracles. The Arizona landscape, so often a canvas of harsh ochres and browns, was softened by the golds of cottonwood trees lining the banks of Whispering Creek. The creek itself no longer whispered. It sang. Its current, full and steady, flowed past Abigail's property, a constant, soothing murmur that spoke of life renewed. The new barn, its fresh pine timbers, smelling sweet in the crisp air, stood as a proud testament not to what was lost, but to what had been built in its place. Inside it was stocked with hay, and her small, replenished herd of cattle drank freely from the creek, untroubled and healthy. Her garden, once a patch of withered despair, now overflowed with late-season squash beans and hardy greens. The land, like Abigail herself, was healing. The town of Redemption had changed, too. The fear that Silas Blackwood had wielded like a weapon had dissipated, replaced by a cautious but tangible sense of order. People spoke to Abigail now, their greetings no longer tinged with pity, but with a deep and sometimes fearful respect. She was the woman who had walked out of the desert with the Apache chief at her side, the woman who had faced down the territory's most powerful bully and won. She had become a local legend, a figure existing in the space between the settled world and the wild one. One afternoon, Sheriff Brody rode out to her ranch, his posture straighter, his gaze clearer than she had ever seen it. He dismounted and accepted a glass of cool water from her well, a gesture that felt both formal and neighborly. "Just wanted to give you the official word, Abigail," he said, wiping his brow. "The federal marshals have taken Blackwood to the prison at Yuma. He won't be troubling anyone for a very long time. Miller and the others who testified received lesser sentences. It's over." "Thank you for letting me know, Sheriff," she said quietly. "No," Brody insisted, looking her straight in the eye. "Thank you. You reminded me that the law is only as strong as the people willing to stand up for it. You and Chief Taza, you forced us all to be better." He gestured toward her thriving ranch. "Things are different now. Calmer. There's an understanding that didn't exist before. The creek flows for everyone, or it flows for no one." After he left, Abigail felt a sense of peace that had been foreign to her for years. The chapter on Silas Blackwood was truly closed. A week later, another visitor arrived. It was not a lawman or a curious townsperson. A lone figure on a pony approached from the east, from the direction of the Dragoon Mountains. As the rider drew closer, Abigail recognized the wise, wrinkled face of Isha, the elderly Chiricahua healer. Abigail met her at the edge of the yard. Isha dismounted with a slow, deliberate grace. There was no grand greeting, no formal pronouncement. The two women healers from different worlds simply looked at each other with a profound, shared understanding. Isha held out a small leather pouch. Inside was a collection of dried mountain sage and a rare, potent root Abigail had only ever read about in botanical texts, known for its ability to calm the deepest fevers. It was a gift of immense value, a sharing of knowledge that transcended language. In return, Abigail led Isha to her own herb-drying racks inside the cabin. She gestured to the carefully bundled desert marigold and the potent creosote leaves, the very plants that had saved Taza's life. Then she pointed to a small pot on her windowsill, where a cutting from a willow tree grew a source of pain relief she knew the Apache also valued. She offered a bundle of the dried willow bark to Isha. The old woman accepted it with a solemn nod. Her dark eyes surveyed Abigail's small, orderly home, lingering on the books and the scientific sketches of plants pinned to the wall. She touched the page of an open book, a faint smile gracing her lips, as if recognizing a kindred spirit in the careful lines and notations. They sat together on the porch for nearly an hour, speaking very little. They shared a cup of mint tea, watching the sun lower toward the horizon. The silence between them was not empty. It was filled with a mutual respect for the quiet power of the earth and the wisdom required to unlock its secrets. When Isha finally rose to leave, she placed a hand briefly on Abigail's arm. It was a simple touch, but it conveyed a universe of meaning, gratitude, kinship, and the acknowledgement of an enduring bond. As Isha rode away, a solitary figure disappearing into the twilight, Abigail stood by the banks of Whispering Creek. She was no longer just a widow, a botanist, or a rancher. She was a bridge. She was a living part of what the townsfolk had begun to call the Creek Accord, an unspoken peace, a recognition of shared destiny. Her life was not the one she had planned with Thomas, but it was a life forged in fire and sand, a life of profound and unexpected purpose. She had found her place not in one world or the other, but in the quiet, vital space in between. The story of Abigail Finch and Chief Taza is a powerful testament to the enduring strength of human compassion in a world defined by conflict. It's a reminder that a single act of kindness offered without expectation of reward can ripple through time and return as a tidal wave of justice. Their journey shows us that true strength isn't found in fences or firearms, but in the bridges we build between worlds, and that honor once given is a debt that is never forgotten. In the vast, unforgiving wilderness of the West, These two unlikely souls proved that the deepest connections are forged not in peace but in the heart of the storm. If this story of courage, honor, and the unexpected turns of fate moved you, please give this video a thumbs up. Share it with others who appreciate tales of the true American West. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that bring history to life.